Good afternoon, I'm Alan Miller and we're at the Proud Galleries for a very important and exciting launch. It's the launch of the Together Declaration, of which I'm a signatory of. The Together Declaration has over 200 campaign leaders, business organisations, professionals, faith leaders and many others who are firmly opposed to the idea of having vaccine passports anywhere in the UK for whatever reason. It's an exciting moment and we're very pleased that you're live with us on Pandemic Podcasts and also on our sites. Everywhere you'll be able to see it and afterwards. And we're going to have a roundtable with many of the signatories that have contributed to the Together Declaration. Remember, it's togetherdeclaration.org. You can go and sign there now from any time. The idea is that we get as many of the public to sign if you agree with us, and that's very important. We also have an audience that are going to ask some questions and answers. So just to say for myself why I have signed this, and you know, Together as a declaration is many different people. It's leaderless, but it's an alliance, an affiliation of many different groups who've all been very vocal in many ways in articulating some of the questions and the problems and the issues with vaccine passports and digital health IDs, show me your papers of any kind. I happen to be very lucky, I think, because I spent 30 years putting on events all around the world. And for me, what that really demonstrated was how much people love coming together. In actual fact, I remember Britain, I'm old now, I tell everyone when I go to licensing meetings and I talk to young people, I'm old. So I remember Britain that was very different. I remember a different that was somewhat parochial and did have a range of issues that were problematic. And the movements that we were involved with dance and clubs and nightlife helped transform many of those things and got people together and eliminate. It wasn't the only thing, but helped us look at we have much more in common with one another, regardless of our particular views or where we've come from or where our families are from, but that we have a lot of fun and joy when we come together. I then, in my life of putting on stuff with the being a lobbyist with the Nighttime Industry Association, have spoken to a lot of governments and city leaders around the world about why social hubs and creative hubs are so important. People like to use terms like regeneration. Everyone likes to talk about people like Stormzy or Adele. But without our creative places where we come and go to, all of those things are impossible. You can't have Fashion Week. You think about design without these areas where we come together. And this is why, for me, it was so important that the question of vaccine passports were checked. The idea that we have a discriminatory two-tier society where we have security guards having to ask people for some of the most sensitive information was just too much. And over 1,000 people agreed in terms of hospitality industry. We've got many of the largest and smallest, and we wanted to become signatories of this Together Declaration, and we've come together to do that. So what I would ask everyone to do, I'm going to certainly ask everyone I know, and it's to share all of this with people. I'd love to see as many of the public come in, because people sometimes say to me, well, why can't just hospitality say we're not going to do it? And we have to remember that licensed premises are licensed. Licensing in Britain and why it came about and what's happened with it. But what it means is that there's very strict restrictions, and you either decide you go out of business or you do what you have to be done. We need the public to have their voices heard now in this. We need you to get involved and sign and say why you're supporting this. And rather than sometimes what I hear on social media and there is nothing we can do and it's all been decided, it hasn't. This is up to us about what we do, and that's a really important thing. And we're very excited that not being in echo chambers anymore, but all of us coming together as many with very different views on a range of different things, but on this in particular, this issue of vaccine passports, digital health IDs, we're firmly opposed. We want to say absolutely not. The government, the Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, you should stand down on this. We do not want it. We will not have it. It's unacceptable. That's why I'd encourage everyone to sign. So I'm going to introduce the first person who's going to speak, also a signatory. For many of you, she won't need much of an introduction. She's done an incredible book called A State of Fear that many of the MPs have put on their top reading list, and it's had great accolades. Certainly for me, it was a very important read in clarifying a number of the things around what's been happening in the last 18 months. So over to Laura Dodsworth.
The UK has no plans to introduce a vaccine passport. Vaccines are not mandated in this country. As Boris Johnson has quite rightly reminded Parliament, That's not how we do things in the UK. We do them by consent. We just don't know yet what the impact of vaccines on transmission is, and it would be discriminatory. I agree, but those are not my words. They're the words of Nadeem Zahawi, who is the Minister for Business and Industry and COVID vaccine deployment, and he said that in February 2021, not very long ago. Informed consent is the ethical bedrock of modern medicine. Coercion through vaccine passports affects informed consent. We're still not completely clear on the extent of the vaccines on interrupting transmission of COVID. It's still very early days. And vaccine passports will be discriminatory. Rather than explain to you why I oppose vaccine passports, I would prefer the government to make a strong argument in favour of vaccine passports, which they have failed to do. In fact, when the Public Administration and Constitutional Affairs Committee had an inquiry into COVID passports, they said the government had failed to make a strong scientific case. At various times, ministers have said there are no plans for COVID passports and it's not how we do things in the UK. Vaccine passports are a complete reimagining of society, and I'm worried that people haven't fully imagined what the consequences will be. They will exclude, divide, compromise privacy, and create a medical papers, please checkpoint society. At the very least, they set a precedent for future erosion of health privacy and checkpoints. But, given the lack of clarity and consistency from the government about vaccine passports, it's easy to imagine them leading to a permanent form of digital ID. Instead of lurching and pivoting our way through the epidemic, I think we should set our sights on where we want to be as a society. I do not like to imagine a two-tier society. I like to imagine that we're better together.
Next up, we've got Dr. Anthony Hinton, who's had 30 years' experience and is a consultant surgeon. Anthony, thank you.
Thank you very much. So I'd like to just talk a little about, is there any actual medical logic to vaccine passports? And I think at the end you'll see, no, there's not. So why is that? Well, probably in this room, there are quite a few people that have had either 1 or 2 jabs and are vaccinated. But almost certainly all of you that have been vaccinated won't be immune, because you can have manufacturing problems, you can have problems with the vaccine being distributed, particularly the Pfizer has to be a very, very low temperature. There's a recent case in Germany where a nurse is being investigated for, she was doing vaccinations, but rather than giving the vaccination, she's been injecting patients with saline, which is just salty water. Up to 9,000 patients that are now having to be traced. You can also be immune but not vaccinated. So there'll be many people again in this room that have had COVID that have immunity, better immunity than from a vaccination, a wider immunity or a deeper immunity, and yet no account is taken for that on the so-called vaccine passport. It is literally just a record of, have you been vaccinated or not? It doesn't tell you if you're immune. It doesn't tell you if you're a risk to anybody else. Even if the vaccines work perfectly, the government scientists admit that the vaccines, although they are very good for you personally to reduce the chance of severe disease, hospitalisation and death, which of course is fantastic, they still make no difference between whether you can catch COVID and whether you can pass on and transmit COVID. So whether you're sitting next to someone that has a vaccine passport or doesn't have a vaccine passport, you can catch COVID from either of those people. So what is the point in the passport? It's completely worthless. Let's look at 2 recent examples. We had a meeting a few weeks ago with Boris Johnson, Sajid Javid and Rishi Sunak. All have had COVID, all double jabbed, all have their vaccine passports. Then a couple of days later, the health secretary tests positive for COVID and the other two have to self-isolate. So where was the use of the passport? Complete nonsense. There was a recent Boardmasters event in Cornwall. Tens of thousands of people attended. You had to have a vaccine passport, either double jabbed or a negative test within 24 hours. Within 10 days, there were almost 5,000 COVID infections linked back to that event. So it was pointless. Evidence is continuing now to show, particularly from Israel, that natural immunity looks to be probably about 7 times more effective than vaccine immunity, which isn't a surprise really, because when you catch a disease naturally, your body will maybe produce 20 different antibodies to all different bits of the virus, plus various cells like your T cells will react, whereas the vaccine just produces antibodies to that particular spike protein. If that bit of the virus changes, then the vaccine doesn't work as well. So the people that have had their natural immunity will be much better in the long run. What happens to those that are more at risk from the vaccine than from COVID? And I would say that's almost anyone below about 30, certainly children. And I have a very good friend who's a nurse that had her first dose of Pfizer the same day that I had my first dose of Pfizer. So I'm double vaccinated, I'm not anti-vax. She had what's called an anaphylactic reaction, which is a very, very severe allergic reaction, the sort of thing that somebody might get a bee sting and die from it. And she had to be admitted to hospital for 24 hours as an emergency, or she would have passed away. Now, she's in the difficult position of having had 1 dose of the vaccine. She's been told by her own medical doctor she cannot have another dose of the Pfizer vaccine. And in fact, because she was so bad, she can't have another dose of any COVID vaccine because it's too dangerous. She speaks to her GP to try to get her vaccine passport. He says, speak to the vaccine hotline. The vaccine hotline say, speak to the GP. And she's just left in limbo. There is a country in the world, of course, that does things more sensibly. And there's one country that we all think of when they do that. And of course, that has to be Sweden. And Sweden has a vaccine passport system that works quite well for everyone because they don't have a domestic vaccine passport system. Finally, I'd just say, what's happened to medical ethics? What's happened to people's bodily autonomy? My body doesn't belong to the state. I mean, even now you're still allowed to opt out of having your organs donated when you die. You do have to opt out now rather than opt in. But so even in death, you can still decide what happens to your own body. But this vaccine thing is just totally unacceptable. So I'd say the vaccine passport basis, it's worse than useless. It's dangerous because you can have people that have the vaccine passport that are feeling unwell but think, I've got my vaccine passport, I can still go to this pub or nightclub and spread the disease. Whereas without it, if you just said to people, look, if you feel ill, stay at home for a few days, which is basically what happens in Sweden. That would be a much better way forward. Thank you.
Thank you. And now we're going to hear from Tonya Buxton, who's a broadcaster. Many of you will have seen her on different TV shows and will know her from her expertise in the restaurant and hospitality arena. Tonya.
Right, so you've heard from these very eminent, bright people. I'm going to give you the reason I'm here today. I've just arrived back from Cyprus and I have seen vaccine passports in action, and it's a horror. You cannot go into the supermarket to buy some bread. You can't sit and have a coffee outside without showing your papers. I actually had to go in and buy some bread and eggs for an old grandmother who was not allowed into the supermarket because she forgot her papers. She couldn't work out her phone. She couldn't do these things. And this is the reality. I've seen the reality of it, and it's a complete horror. This mustn't happen in this country. You've been explained as to why the whole vaccine passport is a just ridiculous thing that doesn't work anyway. It doesn't work with the virus and it doesn't work with society. So it's something that we just must not have in Britain. So I signed the Together Declaration for those reasons. And I would really like all of you at home now to go and sign it. So we've got as many people as possible, because it's all very well us doing it. But unless you, the public, get involved and we get huge numbers, then that's the only way we're going to be able to stop this. So we need you to take action, to go and sign the declaration now, to make a difference before it's too late.
We're very lucky to have all these speakers today. The next person that is coming up is Francis Hoare, who's a barrister and has written, I'm sure many of you will be familiar with, extensively around a number of issues on freedom of speech and many other issues. So, Francis.
Thanks very much, Alan. It's a pleasure to be here. We have had mandatory vaccination in the United Kingdom before. We ended it in 1898. We ended it because we were getting out of the stage where we believed that the poor, which was how that was justified, needed to be told how to behave. It's interesting looking at the old cases that talk about the reaction to it and the paternalistic attitude. And I like to say there are two important legal principles that are related, that this is entirely objectionable to. The first is the legal principle recognised in international law as much as domestic law against coerced medical treatment. And the second is the need for informed consent. Interestingly, as we may know, the development of international law about consent and about coercion against coercion developed after the Second World War, after a period when, not just in the Second World War, but well before, in many countries in the West, experimentation without consent and medical experimentation, was common, and the outcome and the risks were not explained. And that's why, in the Nuremberg trials of doctors after the Second World War, a major declaration was made of the objectionability of coerced medical treatment. That has stood the test of time. It stood the test of time in the Strasbourg Court, in the European Court of Human Rights. It stood the test of time here. It made its way into the Helsinki Declaration, the UNESCO Declaration on Medical Ethics. It's an important principle. But alongside that principle, and equally important, but part of it, is the importance of knowledge and understanding and informed consent. These vaccines are in an early stage of their development. They've been given temporary authorization. That means that if you suffer injury as a result of the vaccination, you are unable to sue Pfizer, Moderna, or any of the other manufacturers. And that's because they're at such an early stage of development. That's important. What is also important is that, and is affected by that, is that we do not know, and we cannot know, the long-term effects of these vaccines. We had a case just 6 years ago in the Supreme Court, a case called Montgomery, in which the Supreme Court justices expressed their objection to the old-fashioned paternalistic idea that people should not be trusted with medical information, that people could not be trusted to understand risks, could not be trusted to weigh up the benefits and the disadvantages according to their circumstances and according to what they considered to be important. That principle, it seems, has been cast aside, like so many others that are at the heart of the way in which we do things as a free and democratic society. Both of those principles, the principle against coercion of medical treatment and the principle of informed consent, are put gravely at risk by having any form of mandatory vaccination. These are objectionable in principle. I would hope that all democratic persuasions, all people who believe in a free and democratic way of life should object to them in principle. And I hope that together we can, by signing this by joining this campaign, we can stop this dangerous trend in its tracks. Thank you very much.
Thanks. I shouldn't feel like I ever should have to declare what I've done with a medical procedure, but I do just say this because I think that there's a lot of people who have signed this who are both vaccinated and unvaccinated. I happen to be vaccinated. My concerns with this are about freedom, about choice, about the political economy that we've got, and the idea that we should have these draconian measures on here. Of course, many people come from different views, and that's why we can all work together, because we have a common interest in addressing these issues and how they're being imposed. Next up, we'll need no introduction from many of you. Dan Astin-Gregory is, as well as the CEO of Elevate, he's the chief of Pandemic Podcast. And over to you, Dan. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Alan. And I'm delighted to be here today standing against the prospect of vaccine passports and COVID certification in the UK. We've heard reasons why the vaccine passports are ineffective. We'd like to see as normal and beginning to live responsibly with the virus. We've heard how the government has taken a maternalistic approach with its citizens, treating its citizens with almost a lack of trust. And part of the reason why this declaration appeals to me in its term Together Declaration is I believe that together we can overcome the challenges that we've witnessed over the past 18 months. We cannot change gone before us, but we can influence the future. Now, within a crisis like we've seen, the human need and its nature for security and safety may take priority during that time. But we also have a need for freedom. We also have a need for an open society. And we cannot allow this crisis to create a trade-off between our freedoms and our safety. I do believe that we can come together to look after one another through the winter, through other times, and that we can to begin to recover the economy. Now, what we've done in the UK throughout the pandemic is typically not separate society based upon a medical choice. And if we want to become leaders internationally as a nation, as a United Kingdom, then we can't kick out our workers because of their choices in care homes, in nightlife. And we can't leave customs behind. We have huge industries that rely and need the custom of our people. But if they cannot shop, or they cannot dine, or they cannot dance, or they cannot learn together because of their own choices, then we are on a very dangerous path. And I believe this government is beginning to interfere more aggressively in our lives in ways that we should not accept. And it's very difficult once you allow that to take that power back, because governments know, and we look to history, it's very difficult to reclaim that as citizens. So we stand at a turning point. We stand at a precipice where I believe together we can say no, and together we can commit to moving forward responsibly, and we can commit to leading the recovery and making this planet a better place to live in for all of us, with no one left behind.
Thank you, Dan. And now we're very lucky to have Reverend Jamie Franklin, who's coming in actually via video from Nottingham. Jamie was one of the leaders who put together the petition of over 1,800 people of faith who were very concerned with having vaccine passports and challenged them, and has now become a signatory for all of that that represents all of the 1,800 on the petition, has signed the Together Declaration. So, Reverend Jamie Franklin, over to you, please. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Alan. It's good to be with you, and thank you for all the work that you've been doing on this fantastic campaign. Now, in many ways, what I'd like to say has already been said in large part. Many of the points that we made in that letter, and the points which I still stand by, are that vaccine passports are indeed illogical and totally unnecessary, and that they constitute an egregious overreach on the part of the government, that they are indeed dangerous in terms of what they open the door for, that they are divisive because they will create a two-tier society, and that they are deeply, deeply discriminatory. So all of those things I've heard people say already today, and I thoroughly agree with them, and I think that they're absolutely correct. Now, what I'd like to add is, as a priest in the Church of England and as a Christian leader, that the idea of vaccine passports in churches or in Christian organisations is absolutely unacceptable and impossible for us. In our letter, we wrote, "For the Church of Jesus Christ to shut out those deemed by the state to be social undesirables would be anathema to us and a denial to the truth of the gospel." And our Lord Jesus himself said, "Come to me, all who labour and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest." He emphatically did not add, "as long as you've been double Pfizer or had a negative lateral flow test in the last 12 hours, or as long as you can prove you've got antibodies," and so on and so forth. I'm intentionally being humorous and satirical here, but the point is very, very serious. The Church, in the words of Pope Francis, is not a house for the righteous, but a hospital for the sick. Our doors will always be open, and the state will not tell us to shut them to anyone. And so, to conclude my short speech, the fact is that Jesus would never turn anyone away if they sought his presence. As a church and as church leaders, we will not turn people away under any circumstance. And as a society together, we should not turn anyone away for these reasons. Thank you very much.
So thank you very much for that. It's really inspiring, and yeah, it's got me going for a moment there. So we're gonna invite anyone in the audience that might have a question or want to say something to come up. You can, if you want to, you can be on the mic here with Charlotte. You can ask any question to any of the panelists or whatever. Come on, yeah, we need to be on the mic, and if you want to, just come on out. So we'll take a little group of 3 or 4 if we've got them, and then we'll go back round again. Thanks.
Hello, I want to say thank you to so many people in this room who have kept most of us sane. At great professional and personal risk often to your reputations and careers to stand up for what the general public, I think, just have really, really needed. I'm Martin Daubney, Deputy Leader of the Reclaim Party. You might remember me from Unlocked, and a general lockdown provocateur. 3 questions, one to you, and one to you, if I could. First of all, how ridiculous and complicit has our media been, and YouGov, the polling industry, in terrorising us into submission? Laura. Doctor, is there any medical foundation for which I think is the hill that I'm prepared to die on, vaccinating children? And thirdly, is there any legal blockage we can put towards that if they start any form of mandatory vaccination towards kids? I'm not going to stand for that. And I think that is how we're going to really, really mobilise people from outside of hospitality, outside of clubs, all this stuff. Parents need a voice. What can we do?
Yeah, oh, sorry. We're not going to do 2 or 3. And then okay, all right. Okay, good point.
So Martin asked me how complicit the media has been. I found the media coverage during the epidemic to be quite bewildering at times, because it has only offered opposition from within a framework, and there's been very little challenge from outside of the framework. And I think there are probably lots of complex factors at play. The classic obvious ones such as proprietor and editorial bias, journalists operating in a rush, in a newsroom, in the teeth of a crisis. But sometimes activism journalism, perhaps some journalists see themselves more as activists. I mean, there was a BBC News article recently about how natural immunity might be as good as vaccinated immunity. And it was as though science was beginning to return to the press room. And I don't really know why this story has appeared so late in the epidemic. That's just one small example. There have been lots of them. And it's been strange to be one of the only journalists speaking against aspects of lockdown and vaccine passports. It's definitely been a year to look for different news sources, hasn't it? I think that's really all I've got to say. Now, yes, the media has been oddly silent on some of these issues.
I would say from a medical point of view, there is no reason at all for children to be vaccinated from this disease. Probably very little for anyone below 30. And certainly no reason for anyone that has already had COVID and has COVID antibodies. Why are we not testing people for antibodies before we even suggest vaccination? Why are we not checking antibodies after vaccination to check that the vaccine has worked? If you look at children, they get virtually zero problems from COVID. The few deaths of children with COVID have been children with leukemia and other serious diseases. They are not fit, healthy children. On the other hand, if we look at the United States, where there's been a big rollout, particularly of Pfizer and more recently Moderna vaccines to the under 18s, there's a particular problem, for instance, with myocarditis, which is inflammation of the heart muscle. Now, it sounds very, very innocent, and you think, well, yeah, a bit of inflammation of the muscle, let it settle down, give it a rest. But the problem is with heart muscle is you're born with a certain amount of heart muscle. If it's damaged, it doesn't recover. You don't get back more heart muscle. It repairs with scar tissue, which can affect the functioning of your heart later on in life as to how strong your heart is. It may give you very strange heartbeats, skipped heartbeats, or very fast heartbeats. No one knows whether in 10 years' time some of these kids with myocarditis will be heading for a heart transplant and all the issues that relate to that. And if it was a serious disease affecting children, you could maybe justify those risks. But it's not a serious disease. For children, all my 3 kids have had COVID. They're 27, 20 and 17. The 2 younger ones are daughters, and at the moment I'm still struggling to try to make them not take the vaccine. The only reason they think of the vaccine is they think about nightclubs and holidays. Now, the 20-year-old I said to, well, you're just talking nonsense because you've been going to nightclubs all through this. You even had a nightclub in your own basement where you were living in Leeds. I said, so it's not to stop you going to nightclubs. And I said, for a holiday, well, the worst you've got to do is take a test. Don't take the vaccine, you know. You can't untake the vaccine. You can take it later if it's proven to be safe in 5 years' time. But for kids, I would say, at least just wait. They don't need it.
Very briefly, yes, there can be legal challenges. Yes, there are challenges to the MHRA authorisation of the vaccine for under 18s and for the introduction of mandatory vaccinations for care home workers. As for vaccine passports, it hasn't happened yet. If it does happen, there will, I'm sure, be a legal challenge to that too.
Hello, my name's Dinah Glover, and thank you very much to Alan Miller for setting all this up and all the wonderful speakers today. This is so vital, what you're doing, and I'm delighted to be one of the signatories 2. I signed it for all the reasons that you guys very eloquently stated, but one of the other reasons that I signed it, and I'd like to hear your views on this, is that what really concerns me is mission creep, that it isn't just going to stop at being a mandatory vaccine passport, it's going to include lots of other things, and it's going to increase the power of government over us, reduce our civil liberties, and the increase of the surveillance state. And I just have one little story to sort of as a beware, is that in the First World War, Lloyd George reduced the hours of pubs because he was worried about munitions workers not working at top speed. This was only repealed, I think, in possibly the late 1980s. So it was sort of something like 70 years. I'm sure Francis will correct me as to when it was. So be very scared.
Hi, my name's Dan Davis. I'm the Chief Exec and Chairman of the Institute of Licensing. I was one of the first people to to break rank and join Alan, simply because I think that my base problems with this are, I think that it's discriminatory, coercive, illiberal, unworkable, and certainly unenforceable. I think as far as the media question before, I think there has been a real lack of proper scrutiny and coverage in the mainstream media, but I watch a lot, or used to. And a simple answer for that, I think, is there's no Chinese wall now between editorial and advertising and the commercial side. And when the government comes along and says, here's a massive big paycheck for loads of adverts and off-the-page press and TV adverts, I think that's silence them. You know, I think also what we've witnessed is probably the biggest heist in British legal history, in the history of the UK. You know, all of the contracts that got awarded to, I won't name the companies, but we all know them. Obviously, all the people who awarded them knew months before, so it's the old friends and family thing. And also the fact that they had a total disregard for the very rules they expected all of us to follow. And that I just also worry, I mean, I've had one vaccination up to now, but I also worry that instead of getting a call in 5 years' time saying, have you been in a car crash, it'll be, did you take the Pfizer vaccine? You know, and things like this, or whatever vaccine. You know, it is still early days. I am against it with children. I think you could ride a coach and horses through the statistics, and I think it's been so stage managed that it really concerns me. And I also operate premises as well, and at no point will I be asking anyone for a vaccine passport or paperwork to come in any of my places. And thanks to all the guys here, you know, really articulated things well, and thanks to Alan, and as I said the other day, right to the end, I'll stand with you, mate.
We're going to come back to the panel in a minute if there's any more coming up. I just want to say that, just on the point of having someone who's the chairman of the Institute of Licensing to come down and speak, excuse me, and put their name on the record and consistently do that, and also have licensed venues, like with Alex Proud and his team, that are allowing us to do this here and has spoken vocally, that's really bravery and that's courage. These are not just putting tweets out, that's great, it's important, but that's not someone sitting awake, that's coming and putting yourself on the line and taking the consequences. So I really like both to Dan Davis and to Alex Proud and his team. And back in the day, I never thought I'd be saying this, but here we have Danny Rampling coming to speak about the international DJ, promoter, producer. Danny.
Yeah, thanks, Alan. So I'm supporting the Together Declaration because I've spent 30 years in the music business and was at the forefront of a great wave of change, creating the electronic music scene in this country. That scene was built on diversity, inclusion and freedom, and has spread throughout the world for what we did here and what we continue to do. Now, over the last 16 months, our industry has been severely impacted and devastated. We've come through the other side of it, and we're slowly getting things on track. It has been very difficult. The introduction of a vaccine passport is beyond whether you agree with the vaccination or you actually disagree with the vaccination. This is way beyond that, and my fear are that it will take us down a very, very dark, dangerous road. It's the blueprint for more sinister things that would follow, like social credit scoring systems, for example, intrusive surveillance. Our medical records are personal. They're not for public consumption. They never have been, and they never will be. We live in a free, open, democratic society that people have fought for, including my own grandfather, who was shelled at Dunkirk. I followed his inspiration and his encouragement, and I took the Queen's shilling and joined the Territorial Army when I was a young man. So why did I do that? I did that because I believe in freedom, and freedom is worth fighting for. And that's what we're doing today. There is no place for a vaccine passport in our democratic society. Britain is a great country, and as it was said earlier, we need to be, Dan said this, we need to be leading the way here, not regressing into this this awful direction if this was to be implemented. We need to come together on this, all of us, and particularly everybody in the music scene and industry. Put your differences aside and actually take a long-term view of the ramifications of a vaccine passport. There's too much short-term thinking, quick fix solutions in society right now, and it's not productive. So take a long-term view, and we have to overturn this, and we cannot have this. It's unacceptable in our democratic society. And the music scene is the envy of the world, and we need to protect the music scene. Many businesses have folded, some people have left the industry. The new wave of young talent need to be encouraged and nurtured to come through in the industry, and we do not need to show papers to go in anywhere, a restaurant, a bar, a hotel, a nightclub, a theatre, anywhere, a shop. It's unacceptable. Thank you. So please sign the declaration and support this great initiative. Thank you.
Okay, what I'm going to ask is for each of the speakers to do a little roundup about why they actually signed the declaration and what they would like to see happen. A lot's come up in this. I mean, one of the questions about the press, obviously we invited the press to both to be on a Zoom and also to come here in person. Some of them have been slightly responsive, but I think now the point is not actually to be too concerned about the whys, but to make a really big statement and get out there, because no one can ignore the public when the public asserts its voice. MPs and councillors are dependent on as their constituents, and if we get enough people in enough places coming out now and saying we're just not going to have it, it's un-British, it's unacceptable, we should not be showing our papers to participate in normal life. The reason many of us, for me certainly, you know, when we had the so-called Freedom Day and then it was delayed, the absolute contempt for the public and everyone of the Prime Minister saying, oh, here's Freedom Day, and by the way, we're going to have mandatory vaccinations, mandatory vaccine passports, sorry. The whole idea that that could be said to us in that way was just so unbelievable and incredible, regardless of all the things that may have happened before and people's views of it. And I think now the time is really to have our voices heard and make a big impact. So I would encourage everyone to have their voices heard, and the press will have to report it. That's the point about the press. So we're going to go in reverse order, and I'm going to just ask everyone to say why they signed this and what they would hope can be achieved from it. So we're going to start with Reverend Jamie Franklin, please.
Thank you very much, Alan. Well, in many ways, in my first answer, I outlined some of the answers to this question. We wrote our open letter to the Prime Minister and to MPs, and we made these points that have already been made today, how illogical, dangerous, divisive, discriminatory these passports are, and that we indeed will not carry this through. We sent that letter to the Prime Minister, and we got a rather, how should we say, condescending response from Michael Gove, but we also sent it to all MPs as well. And I have to say that the overwhelming majority of responses that I've had from MPs has actually been very, very good, and that I have had, I would say, dozens of responses from MPs saying that they oppose these measures and that they're not going to, well, they're going to vote against them. Only a couple in favour. So I would say that on the whole, quite encouraging responses. However, one doesn't want to be naive about these things. So I hope that there's a sense in which there's a great deal of political opposition in Parliament already. So maybe that might be an encouraging thought. And I suppose, as well as signing this declaration, something that everybody can do is write to their MPs and tell them that you oppose this and you don't want this to happen. And indeed, for all people who are Christians and indeed members of churches or members of faith communities, make it known to your leaders how much you oppose these schemes and that you oppose them, and try and convince them to oppose them as well and really bring the issues to bear on them. So that would be my advice. Thank you.
Ultimately, I've signed the Together Declaration because I believe in a free and open society. And I do not believe that a crisis needs to create a trade-off between those freedoms and the idea or illusion of safety. I do believe that both can be achieved, and we're standing at a precipice in time where we are going to enable ourselves, if we're not careful, to divide ourselves even further. There is already a divided society. We already have discrimination. We already have inequalities. We don't want to move backwards, we want to move forwards. Sign the Together Declaration today at togetherdeclaration.org. Thank you.
I signed the declaration because this would put a permanent marker on the change, the devastating change in the relationship between the state and the citizens. The state is here to protect us only where it is proportionate and necessary. It is not for the state to interfere in our daily lives. It is not for the state to protect us when we go to a pub or when we go to a music festival. We are free human beings. If we are free human beings, we must be able to do that without the state telling us in what conditions, how, and with what papers and with what medical certificates we do it. We are Britain. We are not VC France. We are not Germany in the 1930s. We are not a country that has ever asked for our papers. That is not how we do things here. And to have Boris Johnson, of all people, the person who said that he would eat his hat before he agreed to identity cards, the person who always pretended to be a liberal, imposing this, it just shows how utterly contemptible our political class are. We must together fight against that.
Oh my God, what he said is what I feel. But on another level, so I'm a TV chef and I consult in restaurants, and that's kind of what my working hat is. But actually as a mother, these things that look like they're creeping into our society make me have sleepless nights. So as a mother, I don't want my children to grow up in a world that is needing papers to go where they have to go into a supermarket. I've seen it. Like I said, I've just seen it. Go into a supermarket, go anywhere, you have to show your papers. It makes me not sleep at night. So it's really important that all the public go and sign this declaration and stand with us, because we want the free world that we grew up in. Who are we to tell our children that they're going to grow up in a world that is not as free as one we had? How dare we? We have to go and sign this.
I signed it because I think actually together we can stop all of these things. I think parents should speak to other parents, should speak to grandparents about the vaccination of children. I think that can certainly be stopped. I think the vaccine passports can be stopped. Remember, MPs like you when it comes round to an election. I wouldn't just write to your MP. I would write to your MP, and it's very easy. You can just look them up, just type in email my MP into any web browser, and you put in your postcode and your MP will come up. A lot of stuff just fills in for you. It's very straightforward. And you need to email them, tell them that you're against this, tell them that you will watch the way that they will vote, tell them that is the only issue you will be voting on at the next general election, and tell them not only will you not vote for them, you will vote for the opponent that is most likely to defeat them, and then they will listen to you.
So I've puzzled over why vaccine passports are even being introduced. As I tried to say at the beginning, instead of saying why I oppose them, I would have liked the government to make a convincing case for them, which it has completely failed to do. As somebody in the audience said, they're worried about mission creep, and it's my big worry too. After all, we started lockdown with 3 weeks to flatten the curve, and yet here we still are, nearly 18 months later. With the vaccine, we were told 15 million jabs to freedom. We were told the over 50s and the clinically vulnerable should be vaccinated, and their ministers would be on the barricades with us demanding our freedom back. And now we're awaiting a vote, date unspecified, for vaccine passports. Why would we not expect mission creep? Especially when the words that I opened my part with today by Nadeem Zahawi, denying that vaccine passports would be introduced, were spoken when contracts had been awarded to companies to develop vaccine passports. So I think at this stage it would be naive to assume there could be no further mission creep. So I've signed this declaration because I'm very worried about mission creep as well. There is no convincing case for vaccine passports, and the idea of a society where people would not be allowed into any venue, product or service, or barred from civic or business life based on their health status is horrifying. If I was to go to a restaurant and eat food that only the vaccinated could eat, it would stick in my craw. I've already withdrawn from one event that requires a COVID pass because I won't participate in that vision of society. So, if we stand together, there is nothing except to defeat COVID passports, because like Alan said, at the end of the day, it doesn't really matter what media say, it doesn't really matter what politicians want to enforce. Nothing can be done without the consent of the people. So it's for us to say whether we consent to this system or not, and I don't consent. So I've signed the Together Declaration, and I hope everyone else will as well. Together we're stronger. Thank you.
Just before I do my final remarks, I want to bring out someone who's been consistently supportive and brave, as I said, in terms of having his voice heard in public about vaccine passports and why they're unacceptable, and has helped us on a number of occasions with that, and also with the venue today, Proud Galleries, Mr. Alex Proud, to come and say a few words.
Thank you, Alan. And interestingly, having done all that, I've been investigated by Private Eye and the government since. Never let it be said that the sinister police state doesn't exist. On a serious note, we're at the sharp end, as many of you are, in terms of the government and running restaurants and everything else. And I've pushed the line of what I can and can't do over the last 18 months. I think during the summer lockdown, we were visited twice a night, every night for about 2 months, with me pointing out to council officers that there were homeless junkies all over Westminster that they didn't seem to care about, but that tax-paying, employing company was being prosecuted or persecuted. I think the key things we need to remember is I love vaccines. I'm incredibly proud of what our scientists have achieved, but make me have it, and suddenly it becomes very sinister and very connected to various despots over the 20th century that I wouldn't want to mention in this room. Secondly, it discriminates against two key categories of people that affect me specifically: young people who have far less reason to think the vaccine is important or vital to their lives, most of whom are caught the Delta variant over this summer. Certainly about 95% of my staff have, who are under the age of 30. And secondly, it discriminates against minorities who have reason, rightful reason, to fear the government and the police and institutions of authorities. They are far less likely to believe the government or authority when they're told they should do something, as they've been mistreated so repeatedly. And it discriminates against those, and I think that is outrageous and disgusting. I desperately hope it doesn't happen. Thank you all for coming. Alan, thank you for all the fights you've done on all of our behalves over the last 15 months. You're all welcome here. Keep it up, and what am I saying? Together, we're stronger. Thanks very much.
Just a little note on mandatory and voluntary, because like with the government's intention to nudge, which we know they've got, and everyone should read Laura's book who hasn't, but the behavioural psychological unit, the nudge unit, trying to get young people to do it and then saying, oh, well, it's only going to be voluntary. And we're seeing leaks now as well. Voluntary vaccine passports are enormously problematic. Even over the last few weeks, we've seen the attempt to impose them with lots of local authorities around the country. By effect, what the government does is it puts it out there, gets the local authorities, then they run with it, and we have a similar effect. In fact, it's even more problematic at one level, because then you have to have fights around all the different areas. We should absolutely say, we do not accept the idea of vaccine passports or digital health ID, show me your papers, in any form, in any way, because when the live event industry, some of whom have asked for some of this, hear that the public do not want it as well, they will change their tune. They're very nervous about the fact that, understandably, they may be accused of being unsafe. I think we now need to, and this is why I think it's so important, and it's such an honour and a privilege to be around such smart, brilliant people and to be working with everyone. That's great, but what we now need is we need the public. We need all of you to tell all your friends, family, parents, neighbours, everyone, have these discussions. It matters, right? Let's get this petition, let's get the declaration signed like you would do with a petition. Let's get it shared far and wide. You can make a difference, we can make a difference. We can stop this if we work together. We can have our voices heard and we can make the change. So I would encourage everyone to do that. Please go to togetherdeclaration.org, sign it, share it, encourage it. Let's go on and on about it, and we'll deliver that message to the government to stand down and everyone else. I just want to ask you finally to thank the panellists, Dan Astin-Gregory, Laura Dodsworth, Dr. Anthony Hinton, Tonya Buxton, Francis Hoare, and the Reverend Jamie Franklin. Thank you very much. And a big thank you to Alex Proud and the whole team here. Thank you very much.